People like you don't carry $4 million. The bank manager's voice cracked through the lobby like a whip, sharp enough that 3 tellers looked up from their registers and a security guard shifted his weight near the entrance. Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside. Ethan Carter stood at the counter of Liberty National Bank on Michigan Avenue, holding a cashier's check in a hand roughened by years of yard work and grocery bags, wearing a flannel shirt that had gone soft from 100 washes. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. Ma'am, I just need this deposited. It's a legitimate check if you'd like to call the issuing bank. I don't need to call anyone. Rebecca Collins snatched the check from his fingers before he could stop her, holding it up like evidence at a trial, angling it so the small crowd gathering near the roped-off line could see it too. $4 million, she said, letting the number hang in the air with a little laugh attached to it, the kind of laugh designed to invite others to join in. A woman near the ATM machine did. You understand how this looks, don't you? Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, the only sign that anything had landed. I understand exactly how it looks to you, he said quietly. That's the problem. Rebecca didn't hear him or didn't want to. She was already reaching for her phone to call security, already deciding in the space of 30 seconds that this ordinary-looking man in scuffed boots did not belong in her bank, and she was about to tear that check, and the rest of the afternoon into pieces neither of them would ever forget. But rewind, because to understand how a Tuesday afternoon deposit turned into a national headline, you have to understand who Ethan Carter really was, and almost nobody in that room had the faintest idea. Ethan was 58 years old, and for the last 12 of those years he had been raising his daughter alone. Lily Carter was 19 now, a sophomore at DePaul University, but Ethan still saw her sometimes as she'd been the day her mother died. 7 years old, sitting on the hospital floor because no one had thought to tell her to use a chair, asking him in a small voice why Mommy's hands felt so cold. Her mother, Diane, had fought ovarian cancer for 11 months. Ethan had held her hand through every one of them, and when it was over, he had made a promise to himself that he intended to keep for the rest of his life. Lily would never doubt, not for one single day, that she was loved beyond measure, and she would never learn to judge a person by the size of their house or the make of their car. That promise was easier to keep than most people would guess, because Ethan Carter did not live like a wealthy man. He drove a 2004 Ford F-150 with a dent in the tailgate he'd never bothered to fix. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation, bought his boots at a working man's outfitter on the south side, and ate breakfast most mornings at a diner called Rosie's, 2 blocks from the modest brick house he and Lily had lived in since she was a toddler. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, friendly man who mowed his own lawn, waved from his truck, and always had time to help push a stuck car out of a snowbank. What none of them knew, what almost no one outside a small circle of attorneys, fund managers, and one very discreet accountant knew, was that Ethan Carter was the founder and majority owner of Carter Capital Group, an investment firm that quietly managed several $1 billion in assets, with holdings that touched everything from Midwestern manufacturing to green energy startups to, as it happened, a controlling stake in the holding company that owned Liberty National Bank itself. Ethan had built the company from nothing, starting in a cramped office above a laundromat in the early 90s, and he had built his fortune the old-fashioned way, patiently, methodically, without ever needing anyone to know his name. He gave to charity anonymously. He turned down magazine profiles. When forced to attend galas, he wore the same navy suit he'd bought a decade earlier and left before dessert. His philosophy was simple, and he'd said it to Lily more times than either of them could count. Money changes what you can do, sweetheart. It should never change who you are. That Tuesday, Ethan had a check for $4 million in his coat pocket. Proceeds from the sale of a stake in a logistics company he'd helped grow from a 2-truck operation into a regional powerhouse. The money wasn't going into his own account. It was the seed funding for something he'd been planning quietly for 2 years, the Diane Carter Memorial Foundation, a scholarship fund for first-generation college students from working-class families, named for the wife he'd lost and built in the spirit of the woman she'd been, a public school teacher who'd spent her whole career telling kids from the wrong side of the tracks that they were capable of anything. He planned to deposit the check swing by DePaul to pick up Lily, and take her to dinner to celebrate. It should have taken 15 minutes. Instead, he found himself standing at the counter of his own bank, being laughed at by a woman who had already decided who he was before he'd said a single word. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to lower your voice," Rebecca said, though Ethan hadn't raised it at all. She was in her late 30s, sharply dressed, blonde hair pulled back into a severe bun, and she had the particular confidence of someone who had climbed the ladder at Liberty National by being decisive. Decisive, in this case, meaning fast to judge and slow to reconsider. We see checks like this all the time: counterfeit cashier's checks, forged signatures, people trying to walk out of here with cash before the bank figures out it's fake. "Then verify it," Ethan said evenly. "Call the issuing institution. It'll take 5 minutes. I'll wait right here." "I don't have 5 minutes to waste on every person who walks in here with a story," Rebecca snapped. And this time her voice did carry, drawing a few more heads. Near the second window, a young teller named Emily Parker had gone very still, watching the exchange with a knot forming in her stomach. Emily had been at Liberty National for exactly 6 weeks. She didn't know Ethan Carter, but something about the calm, tired patience in his eyes, the way he wasn't flinching, wasn't raising his voice, wasn't performing outrage, struck her as fundamentally different from what a con artist would look like. "Rebecca," Emily said quietly, stepping halfway out from behind her window, "maybe we should just call it in. It only takes—" "I've got this, Emily." Rebecca didn't even look at her. "Go help the next customer." Emily hesitated, glanced at Ethan, and then reluctantly stepped back, feeling something twist inside her that she wouldn't be able to shake for days. By now, 4 or 5 customers in line had pulled out their phones, filming with the particular thrill people feel when they sense they're witnessing something that might end up online by dinner time. A man in a puffer jacket near the entrance muttered to his friend, "Bet you $100 that check bounces." Nobody said a word in Ethan's defense. Nobody asked Rebecca to slow down, to check first, to consider that maybe, just maybe, a quiet older man in a flannel shirt might actually be exactly who he claimed to be. That was the part that stung the most, though Ethan would never have admitted it out loud. Not the accusation, not even the check being at risk. It was the silence of an entire room full of strangers, all of them deciding in real time that a workingman's clothes were reason enough to assume the worst. "Ma'am?" Ethan tried again, keeping his voice level, though something in his chest had gone tight and cold. "I've banked at this branch for 6 years. I have accounts here. If you pull up my information—" "I have pulled it up." Rebecca's smile turned thin and triumphant, as if she'd caught him in a lie. "And you know what I see? A basic checking account with a balance under $2,000. Does that look like the account of someone who just happens to be carrying a $4 million check?" It was true. Ethan's personal checking account, the one he used for groceries and gas and Lily's tuition payments before financial aid kicked in, was, by design, unremarkable. His real assets lived in trusts and holding accounts managed by Carter Capital's own compliance team, structured deliberately so that no teller at any branch, anywhere, would ever need to know who he was. He had built that wall of anonymity himself, brick by brick, for exactly the kind of privacy he valued. He had never imagined it would be used as a weapon against him. "The account doesn't tell the whole story," Ethan said quietly. "No," Rebecca agreed, holding the check up higher, almost gleeful now, playing to the small crowd that had gathered behind the velvet rope. "I think it tells the entire story." And then, without warning, without one more second of hesitation, she tore the check in half. The sound of it, that small, crisp rip, seemed to echo through the marble lobby far louder than it had any right to. Somewhere behind Ethan, a woman gasped. A phone camera zoomed in. Rebecca tore it again, into quarters, and let the pieces flutter down onto the counter like confetti at the world's cruelest parade. "There," she said, dusting her hands together as though she'd just accomplished something admirable. "Problem solved. Now I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises, or I will have security escort you out. And frankly, sir, you're lucky I'm not calling the police for attempted fraud." For one long moment, Ethan Carter said nothing at all. He looked down at the torn pieces of paper scattered across the marble counter. pieces of a check that represented not just money, but a promise, a memory of his late wife, a scholarship for kids who needed someone to believe in them, the way nobody had believed in Rebecca's assumptions about him. He thought of Diane's voice, the way she used to say that the measure of a person wasn't how they treated the powerful, but how they treated the ones they thought they could get away with mistreating. "You're going to want to think very carefully about what you just did," Ethan said, his voice quiet but suddenly carrying a weight it hadn't had a moment before. Rebecca laughed, an actual laugh, short and disbelieving. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact." Ethan didn't move. "Call the police if you'd like. I'd actually prefer it, because I'd like there to be a record of exactly what happened here today." Rebecca, emboldened rather than chastened, reached for the phone at the desk and did exactly that. Within minutes, a security guard named Marcus was standing beside Ethan, with his hand hovering near Ethan's elbow, not quite grabbing him, but close. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me." "I haven't done anything wrong," Ethan said, still calm, though Lily's face flashed in his mind, how she would feel if she could see her father being frog-marched out of a bank lobby in front of a dozen strangers filming on their phones, humiliated for the crime of dressing like the working man he chose to be. He thought about fighting it, about simply saying the 4 words that would end this in an instant. "Do you know who?" And something in him refused. Not out of pride, out of principle. He had never once used his name to get out of trouble, and some stubborn part of him wasn't going to start now, even as Marcus's grip tightened slightly on his arm, and Rebecca watched with the satisfied expression of a woman who believed she'd just protected her institution from a con man. "This is insane," Emily whispered to the teller beside her, unable to look away as Ethan was walked toward the glass doors, past the rows of onlookers, several of whom were still filming, a couple of them even snickering. "She didn't even call to verify it. She just ripped it up." Outside on the sidewalk, a black Lincoln Navigator pulled up to the curb at that exact moment, and out stepped a man in a tailored grey suit, checking his watch with the practiced impatience of someone with back-to-back meetings. His name was David Whitfield, regional president of Liberty National Bank's entire Midwest division, and he had exactly 1 meeting on his calendar that afternoon, a private, long-scheduled sit-down with the branch's most significant institutional client, a man his own executive team referred to, with no small amount of reverence, as Mr. Carter. David glanced up as he walked toward the entrance and stopped cold. There, being escorted through the glass doors by a uniformed security guard, flanked by 2 police officers who had just arrived, was the very man David had driven 40 minutes to meet. "Mr. Carter?" David's voice came out strangled, disbelieving. He nearly dropped his briefcase. Every head in the lobby turned. Rebecca, standing near the counter with the torn pieces of the check still scattered in front of her, felt something cold drop through her stomach at the sound of David Whitfield's voice using that name, Mr. Carter, in a tone that suggested this was not, in fact, a random man off the street. "David," Ethan's voice was calm, almost gentle, as if none of the last 20 minutes had happened at all. "I was actually on my way to see you." David's eyes darted from Ethan's face to the security guard's hand still hovering near his arm, to the police officers now looking distinctly uncomfortable, to Rebecca, whose face had gone the color of chalk. "What?" David said slowly, each word landing like a dropped stone. "Is going on here?" "Sir," Rebecca started, her voice suddenly much smaller than it had been 5 minutes earlier, "this man attempted to deposit a check for $4 million, and when I couldn't verify—" "You couldn't verify it?" David repeated. "Because you didn't call anyone, did you?" He looked at Ethan, who said nothing, which was somehow worse than any accusation could have been. David's gaze dropped to the torn scraps of paper on the counter, and his face went through several colors in rapid succession, pale, then red, then a kind of ash gray that comes from realizing exactly how much trouble you're in. "Tell me, that is not what I think it is." Nobody answered. The silence answered for them. "This man," David said, turning slowly to address not just Rebecca but the entire lobby, his voice rising with a controlled fury that made even the police officers take a half-step back, "is Ethan Carter, founder and CEO of Carter Capital Group. He is the single largest institutional investor this bank has. His firm holds a controlling interest in the holding company that owns this branch, this building, and, quite possibly, your paycheck, Ms. Collins. He sits 2 seats away from our board chairman at the annual shareholders meeting, and you just had him arrested." The words landed in the lobby like a slow-motion collapse. Somewhere near the back, one of the customers who had been filming lowered her phone very, very slowly, her mouth hanging open. The man in the puffer jacket who had bet his friend the check would bounce looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Emily Parker, standing frozen behind her teller window, felt something between vindication and nausea rise in her chest all at once. Rebecca's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. That's not... There's no way that a man like that would be wearing... "A man like that?" David's voice was ice now. "You mean a man who built a company from nothing? A man who has never once needed to prove anything to anyone, least of all to a branch manager who apparently decided that a flannel shirt was more reliable evidence than an actual conversation." He turned to the police officers, his voice shifting into something crisp and formal. "Officers, I sincerely apologize for wasting your time. There has been no crime here. Quite the opposite." One of the officers, a younger man who had clearly sensed the shift in the room's temperature before anyone explained it to him, nodded and quietly told the security guard to stand down. Marcus released Ethan's arm as if it had suddenly caught fire, muttering an apology that got lost somewhere in his throat. Ethan simply bent down without a word and began gathering the torn pieces of the check off the counter, placing them carefully in his coat pocket, the way a man might gather up fragments of something far more valuable than paper. "Mr. Carter, I don't even have the words," David said, his composure cracking around the edges now that the crisis had passed and the magnitude of it was setting in. "I will personally see to it that this is made right. The check will be replaced immediately today, and I want you to know this is going to be investigated thoroughly." "I know it will," Ethan said quietly, "because I'm going to make sure of it." He looked then directly at Rebecca Collins for the first time since the check had been torn. She had gone rigid, her earlier confidence entirely evaporated, replaced by the particular terror of someone watching her career disintegrate in real time in front of a room full of witnesses, several of whom still had their phones out and recording, capturing every second of what would, within hours, become the most watched video in the bank's history. "I want you to understand something," Ethan said to her, and his voice wasn't cruel, it was almost sad. "This isn't about the money. I've had far more embarrassing things happen to me than a torn check. What bothers me is that you looked at a person, decided in about 4 seconds who he was and what he deserved, and you never once considered that you might be wrong. And nobody in this room," his gaze swept slowly across the lobby, across the customers still frozen with their phones in hand, "nobody said a word to stop you. Not one person asked you to slow down. That's the part that should scare all of you. Not that I turned out to be someone important, that it could have been anyone standing here, and the outcome would have been exactly the same." The lobby was utterly silent. Somewhere, a printer hummed. Nobody moved. "I'd like a copy of your incident report," Ethan said to David, "and I'd like to speak with your compliance and HR teams by the end of the week, not to punish anyone rashly, to fix something that's clearly broken if it can produce this in 6 minutes flat." "Of course," David said, "whatever you need." Ethan nodded once, turned, and walked out of the bank the same way he'd walked in, unhurried, unremarkable to anyone who didn't already know better, except that now every single person in that lobby was watching him leave, with an expression that had transformed entirely from suspicion to something closer to shame. He didn't say another word to Rebecca. He didn't need to. Her own silence, and the look on her face, said everything that needed saying. By the time Ethan pulled his old Ford pickup into the DePaul University parking lot 40 minutes later, the video was already climbing past 10,000 views on social media, posted by one of the customers who'd been filming. A clip titled simply, "Bank Manager Rips Up Billionaire's Check Thinking He's Homeless." By the time he'd found a spot and turned off the engine, it had crossed 50,000. Lily was waiting on the steps outside her building, backpack slung over one shoulder, and the moment she saw her father's truck, her whole face lit up the way it always did. The same open, easy joy she'd had since she was small, utterly unchanged by the fact that half of Chicago now knew her father's name. She climbed into the passenger seat, tossed her bag in the back, and immediately clocked something in his expression. "Dad?" She studied him. "What happened? You look—" "I don't know. Tired. Weird tired." Ethan managed a small smile, pulling out of the lot. "It's been a day." "A day like a good day, or a day like a we need to talk about it over dinner day?" "Probably the second one." Lily didn't push right away. She'd learned over the years that her father processed things slowly, quietly, the way he did everything, turning a problem over in his hands like a piece of wood he was deciding how to carve. So she let the radio play low, let the city slide by outside the window, and waited until they were home, until dinner was on the table, until the quiet settled into something comfortable enough for him to speak. "I went to deposit the check today," Ethan finally said, pushing food around his plate without much interest in eating it. "The one for the foundation." Lily looked up immediately. "Okay, and?" "And the branch manager decided I didn't look like the kind of person who could be carrying $4 million. He said it plainly without drama, though Lily saw something flicker behind his eyes. "She wouldn't verify it. She accused me of fraud. She had me thrown out. And then in front of everyone she tore it up." Lily's fork clattered against her plate. "She what? Dad, did you—" "I didn't tell her who I was," Ethan said. "Not until David showed up for our meeting and recognized me on his way in." "Oh my God!" Lily sat back, stunned, already reaching for her phone out of instinct, before catching herself and setting it down again, choosing instead to look at her father, really look at him. "Dad, are you okay? Like, actually okay?" It was, Ethan thought, such a Lily question. Not what happened to the bank, not what happened to the manager. "Are you okay?" He reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'm okay," he said. It stung more than I expected it to, if I'm honest. Not the accusation. The way nobody in that room said a word. A dozen people watched a woman tear up a stranger's check and humiliate him, and every single one of them just filmed it, like it was entertainment. Lily was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "Why didn't you just tell her who you were right away? You could have ended it in like 2 seconds. Ethan set down his fork. This was the conversation he'd been waiting to have with her for years, in one form or another. Not planned exactly, but always somewhere on the horizon. The way you know eventually you'll need to explain to your child why the world works the way it does. "Because if I'd said my name the second she started judging me," he said slowly, "then all it would have proven is that rich people deserve respect and everybody else doesn't. That's not the lesson I want you carrying around, Lily. I wanted to see how far she'd go treating an ordinary man like garbage, and the answer was pretty far, all the way to having him arrested." He shook his head. "How your mother used to say the truest test of someone's character isn't how they act with people who can do something for them. It's how they act with people they think can't." Lily's eyes had gone glassy, the way they always did when her mother came up, even 7 years on. She would have hated that story. "She would have," Ethan agreed, "but she also would have said it was a good thing it happened to me instead of somebody who didn't have the money to fight back, or the voice to make sure it mattered." He looked at his daughter carefully. "That's the part I want you to understand. It's not really about me getting humiliated for 20 minutes in a bank lobby. It's about how many people that woman has probably treated exactly the same way over years, who didn't have a regional president walk in and vouch for them. People who left that bank feeling small and never got an apology. That's what I intend to fix." Lily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, laughing a little despite herself. "You're always doing this. Turning your own bad day into a life lesson for me. Occupational hazard of being your father." Ethan smiled finally for real. "You're allowed to be furious on my behalf, by the way. I was for about 30 seconds. I'm furious for you and for everyone that woman's probably done this to before," Lily said. And there was an edge in her voice that reminded Ethan powerfully of Diane, that same fierce, protective fire that had made his late wife march into school board meetings on behalf of kids who weren't even hers. "What are you going to do?" "I already know what I'm going to do," Ethan said, "but I want to hear what you think first." They talked for almost 2 hours that night, father and daughter, about dignity and appearances and the particular cruelty of being underestimated by people who had never once had to fear being underestimated themselves. Lily suggested things Ethan hadn't even considered. Mandatory training on unconscious bias, not just for tellers, but for managers with the power to escalate situations. A formal customer bill of rights posted in every branch, a direct hotline for complaints that bypassed branch management entirely. Ethan wrote half of it down on a napkin, smiling the whole time, because his 19-year-old daughter was, without question, better at this than most of the consultants his firm had ever hired. The following morning, the video had crossed 2 million views. News outlets from Chicago and eventually national networks had picked up the story. Billionaire humiliated at his own bank over his clothes ran across a dozen different headlines by Thursday. Liberty National's stock dipped slightly on the news, then recovered within days once the bank issued a public statement, but the reputational damage inside the company was severe and immediate. Rebecca Collins was placed on administrative leave within 24 hours, and following an internal review that Ethan insisted be conducted by an independent third party, not by his own people because he didn't want this to look like personal retribution. She was terminated 2 weeks later, not merely for the incident itself but for a pattern of complaints filed against her over the previous 3 years that had never been properly investigated. Emily Parker, the young teller who had tried quietly and unsuccessfully to intervene, received a personal letter from Ethan Carter himself, along with an unexpected and substantial recommendation that she be considered for a management training program. "You were the only person in that entire lobby," the letter read, "who tried to do the right thing when it would have been so much easier not to. That matters more than you know." David Whitfield, to his credit, didn't try to bury the story or spin it into something smaller than it was. He held a press conference 8 days after the incident, standing in front of the same branch, and announced a company-wide initiative, customer dignity training across every Liberty National location in the country, an anonymous reporting system for customers who felt they'd been treated unfairly, and a public commitment that no employee, regardless of position, would ever again be permitted to refuse basic verification procedures based on a customer's appearance. Ethan stood beside him for exactly 4 minutes, said a short, quiet statement about second chances and the responsibility that comes with power, and then left before any reporter could ask a single follow-up question. It was, several journalists noted afterward, the least self-promotional response to going viral that any of them had ever witnessed. 2 weeks after the incident, Ethan sat down with David and the bank's compliance team and formally established the terms of the Diane Carter Memorial Foundation. The $4 million, reissued promptly, this time without incident, became the founding gift, but Ethan didn't stop there. He negotiated an ongoing partnership. For every year, Liberty National maintained its new customer dignity standards, verified by that same independent auditor. Carter Capital would match an additional $1 million into the scholarship fund. It was, in effect, an incentive built directly into the bank's own conscience, ensuring that what happened to him could never happen again to someone with far less power to fight back. The foundation's first scholarship recipients were announced that spring, 12 students from working-class families across Chicago, several of them the first in their families ever to attend college. At the small announcement ceremony, held not at some glittering downtown hotel but in the gymnasium of the public high school where Diane had taught English for 18 years, Ethan stood at a modest podium in the same navy suit he always wore to formal events, and Lily sat in the front row, beaming. "My wife believed," Ethan told the room, his voice steady but full, "that everybody carries something inside them worth investing in, whether or not the world bothers to look closely enough to see it. She spent her whole life proving that to kids nobody else believed in. This foundation is my way of making sure that belief outlives both of us." He paused, glancing toward Lily, who was already crying, unashamed, in the front row. "A few weeks ago, I found out the hard way that some people decide what you're worth before they ever take the time to actually see you. I hope every student who walks through these scholarships knows that the reverse is also true, that you don't have to prove anything to anyone in order to deserve respect. You already do." Months later, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Ethan Carter walked back into that same Liberty National branch on Michigan Avenue, Lily beside him, both of them dressed exactly as they always dressed. Ethan in his flannel shirt, Lily in jeans and a DePaul sweatshirt. The moment they stepped through the doors, every single employee in the lobby turned, and this time there was no laughter, no whispered judgment, no phones raised in mockery. There was only quiet, genuine respect, the kind that has nothing to do with a person's net worth and everything to do with finally, belatedly, seeing someone clearly. Emily Parker, now a junior manager herself, came around from behind her window with a warm smile. "Mr. Carter, Lily, it's good to see you both." "Good to see you too, Emily," Ethan said, meaning it. "How's the new position treating you?" "Better every day," she said. "We've actually changed a lot around here." "I heard," Ethan said, glancing briefly toward the counter where months ago pieces of a torn check had scattered across the marble. "I'm glad." He didn't need an apology from that counter. He didn't need anyone to grovel or perform contrition for the cameras. What he needed, what actually mattered, was walking back through those doors as exactly the same man he'd always been, dressed exactly the same way, and being met not with suspicion, but with simple human decency. That was the whole point. That had always been the whole point. As they walked back out to the truck afterward, Lily slipped her arm through her father's, the late afternoon sun slanting gold across Michigan Avenue. "You know," she said, "you never actually got mad. Through this whole thing, I would have lost it." "I got mad," Ethan admitted, smiling. "I just decided being useful mattered more than being satisfied. Anger fades. What you build instead of it, that sticks around." Lily leaned her head briefly against his shoulder as they walked, the way she used to when she was small enough for him to carry, and neither of them said much else the rest of the way to the truck. They didn't need to. Some lessons don't require more words once they've truly landed. And maybe that's the real question worth sitting with tonight. Not whether you'd recognize a person like Ethan Carter if he walked past you at the grocery store or stood behind you in line at the bank, but whether it would even matter to you either way. Whether kindness in your hands requires proof of somebody's bank balance before you're willing to hand it out. If this story moved you even a little, if it made you think twice about the next stranger you're tempted to size up in 30 seconds flat, do me a favor and drop a comment below. I'd genuinely love to hear which part hit you hardest. Give this video a like if you believe dignity shouldn't come with a price tag, and if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there are plenty more journeys like Ethan's still waiting to be told.